Tax has been dominating federal politics this week as the government tries to secure support for their legislation to reduce company tax from 30 to 25%. The government has been negotiating with crossbenchers, but Finance Minister Matthias Cormann has ruled out exempting banks or forcing businesses to increase wages.
Well, to discuss this and more, we're joined by Federal Labor MP Emma Hussar, and from Brisbane we're joined by Assistant Minister for Social Services and Disability Services, Jane Prentice. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
So we've seen a number of proposals put by the crossbenchers this past week on how to get the company tax through. Emma, let me start with you. Do any have your support? We saw Derryn Hinch, for instance, rule in, then rule out the possibility that the banks could be excluded from the deal. Now he's looking at pensioners. What are your thoughts?
Look, I mean, we saw obviously One Nation and Pauline Hanson do a deal where she said, oh, well, I'll support this if I get 1,000 apprentices in Queensland. Now, that's not even 0.7% of the apprentices that have been lost. So we've lost 140,000 apprentices under this government, and she signed away $65 billion in tax cuts so that she could get another 1,000 apprentices, which is just a ridiculous proposal from her. Derryn Hinch's proposal, I think you could just flip a coin with him some days and see which way he's going to go. You know, he's in one day and out the next day, and I think that's the difficulty of negotiating with the crossbenchers. Obviously, Labor doesn't support these tax cuts for massive businesses who, quite frankly, we're not going to see the trickle-down effects that the government promise. We're not going to see an increase in wages. We're not going to see a decrease in casualisation of the workforce. We're not going to see any benefits to the ordinary workers. You've got NAB that have just posted a $6.6 million profit who are looking to slash 6,000 jobs. You know, they've got quite enough money and they're about to cut 6,000 people out of work. So I think it's a falsehood, and I think that they're hoodwinking the Australian people.
Jane, it has been suggested that perhaps a condition for this tax cut is that businesses are then forced to pass on any benefit to wages. Matthias Cormann has ruled out ordering businesses to increase wages. Why?
Well, we're not a socialist country. We do believe in democracy. We believe in companies having the right to set their own parameters. At the end of the day, we need to provide the environment for companies to prosper, and that's what we're doing. These record economic growth by the coalition government, the record jobs growth, it doesn't happen by accident. So government's role is to provide the right environment for them, and then companies, and Fortescue Mining and others have already come out and said, with this sort of support, you will see jobs and growth as well as wages growth. And that's what happens. When you have a prosperous and productive company, it flows on to the workers and the shareholders. Now, our problem is that America has just reduced theirs from 30% to 21% immediately. We're reducing ours from 30% to 25% over 5 years. We're still going to be in the higher levels of OECD countries, but we need to provide the right environment. Now, Bill Shorten is all over the shop on this. Not so long ago, Labor and Bill Shorten agreed with this approach. In fact, they wrote books about it. But let's see, it's Saturday, so maybe they've changed their position again. At the end of the day, if Labor was serious about supporting tax reform and tax on companies, they would be supporting our legislation to recoup money from multinational tax avoiders. They voted against our legislation, which is now recouping $5 billion from tax avoiders. So Labor have nowhere to go on this. They do not support us, and they don't support companies who are trying to grow and strengthen their jobs.
Emma, just a quick response there.
What kind of environment do you want business to prosper in when you've got National Australia Bank, the example I used, posting record profits about to slash 6,000 jobs? So it's saying, well, we've got plenty of money, but we're still going to make job cuts. We're still going to, you know, people are still going to face losing their jobs. So I find it quite ridiculous that they say we're going to do it if we get this. And also, Jane used the example of America. I mean, look at their industrial system. You've got people that are working 40, 60 hours a week, still living in poverty over there because they don't have good industrial conditions.
Jane, can I just ask you, will the government need to make some concessions to get this across the line?
Look, Matthias Cormann, of course, is very safe hands in the Senate, and he's talking to the crossbenchers. I'm confident the crossbenchers understand the importance of this legislation, and they might have their own pet projects that they want to put on the back of it. But at the end of the day, they know the importance of it. The coalition government is not against profit. We support companies making a profit because it flows on to their shareholders, it flows on to their workers, it results in job and wage increases. So that's why we support this legislation.
Emma, 10 of the nation's largest companies have pledged to, quote, invest more in Australia, which will lead to employing more Australians and therefore stronger wage growth as the tax cut takes effect. That's a good thing, isn't it?
Oh, look, you know, that's 10 companies out of how many? I don't think that we can rely on them just to do the right thing. I have not seen in my history where a CEO voluntarily gives up extra pay or gives up extra money to shareholders in favour of employees. In fact, we see the opposite of that is true. Whenever a government department or whenever a company is in trouble, the first thing to go are people and wages. So I don't have the great faith that just because 10 companies say they will do the right thing, that will naturally flow on to those other companies who will benefit from this.
Jane, can I just press that point then? Will you need to make some concessions there, though, to get this through? Because obviously you need that support from the crossbenchers. You've got to give them something.
Look, I'll leave that in the hands of Matthias Cormann, but we don't need to make concessions. This is good policy and it's good legislation. The finance sector contributed $14 billion in taxes last year, and as we know, the big banks have been levied an extra $6 billion. So they are making a contribution. Their profits flow on to their shareholders and they flow on to their workers. And that's what we want to see. Government's job is to provide that environment for companies to prosper, because that's when we see the growth, and that's why coalition policy has delivered record economic growth and record jobs growth.
Emma, this week the ACTU also spoke about workers and about the casualisation of the workforce and particularly conditions for casual workers. The government has disputed that job insecurity is on the rise. Who's right there?
So it is on the rise. It is on the rise slightly. I think it's gone up about 3% in the last couple of years. But also we're looking at those people who are offered only 6-month contracts or only 1-year contracts. That is still a form of insecure work.
Do you support the comments made by Sally McManus from the ACTU midweek in regards? She wants to see sweeping changes in the workforce. She was also quoting some figures to say casualisation has increased substantially over the past decade. That's disputed by many economists who say essentially it's remained stable.
It's gone up about 3%. So it is on the rise. But what we're seeing is the NDIS, for example, where everybody that is hired in the NDIS largely to provide services to people with a disability are employed on casual contracts. Now that gives no one any job stability. You cannot buy a house, you cannot service your mortgage, you cannot pay your bills on a casual income. And also, you know, it doesn't provide any security if you're unwell or if you need to take time out of the workplace to care for someone at home. So you've got all these people running around on insecure contracts or on insecure work who actually can't plan for their future, they can't plan for their families, and they can't make decisions which increase the stability of their home life.
Jane, do we need to have a look at casual contracts? For example, the 6-month contract, if they've been working in a permanent position for 6 months, then they can then reassess that employment and make it more regular?
Look, you mentioned Sally McManus before. This is a classic fake news story by Sally McManus and Bill Shorten. The reality is that the coalition government, as I said before, is delivering record jobs growth. More than 1,000 jobs a day. Now, of those, 75% are full-time. And we look at the proposal by Sally McManus who suggests, and Shorten, who suggest that in fact casualisation is increasing. It's not. Fact check it with ABC. It is not true. The reality is that the casualisation of the workforce has always run between 20 and 25% for the last 20 years. Not the last 3 years, for the last 20 years. It has not changed. And I dispute what Emma says about the NDIS workforce, because what I'm seeing, particularly in remote and regional parts of Australia, is that where a lot of the providers and workers in this sector were on casual rates and had sporadic employment, they're now being employed full-time. So there are great opportunities through NDIS for work. And don't forget also that casual workers get a 25% premium on their salary to make up for the fact they don't get paid leave. Also, can I just say, there are workers out there who like to be casual workers because it suits their lifestyle.
All right. Look, Emma, you want to respond to that?
Oh, look, I sat through weeks and weeks of inquiries with the NDIS where people come to us and tell us that their jobs are incredibly insecure. We've seen a huge rise in the number of people on casual contracts with the NDIS because it's gone from being block funded to individualised funding, and there is absolutely no security. It happened last week when I was up in Cairns. I heard from a whole raft of people, so I suggest that maybe Jane has a look at the transcript of that.
All right, now look, this may well be an election issue. I think you've indicated it probably will be as far as Labor is concerned with the next election, along with education and hospital funding. Now, I know you wanted to talk about that as well.
Look, I represent an area where we have the most under pressure hospital in New South Wales, code for the worst performing hospital, not through the hard work and dedicated doctors and nurses who are there. We have not seen an increase in clinical funding, so we haven't seen an increase in doctors or nurses that are there to staff the hospital. And this $65 billion tax cut is about a choice. We need 1/9 of that, $715 million to be put back in our hospital system to actually really fix it up and to deliver health services to people across this country. Have been fighting tooth and nail for my local hospital, but as a mum, I've used that hospital time and time again, and it's been, it is a huge, benefit to people in our communities when they can get access to the healthcare that they require. So funding hospitals is just one arm of government. Obviously, schools is another one. But when you're looking down, the choices that we get to make in government and the privilege that we get to sit over, presiding over those choices and choosing $65 billion in tax cut at the expense of hospitals and health of our country, you've really got to ask yourself, how out of touch is Malcolm Turnbull?
Jane, does the government need to reassess its priorities and perhaps focus more on funding hospitals?
Yet another fact-check opportunity. The reality is the coalition government has delivered $103 billion over 4 years increase in health funding. And this is in stark contrast to many of the state governments. Now, that funding was signed up to by every state and territory minister. And I look my local area, Metro North, in Brisbane. Now, the funding there has actually increased 38% by the federal government, and yet our Queensland state Labor government has only increased funding by 4%. Doctors and nurses increases are a state issue. So the reality is that the federal government is delivering the funding, but the state Labor governments are not delivering on the ground. And in Queensland, they wasted billions of dollars on that appalling health payroll system at a time when we needed more frontline nurses and doctors. So the incompetence of administration shouldn't be taken into account when we're looking at funding. The coalition government has actually delivered another $7.5 billion to release drugs onto the PBS, which is helping people in our community. Under Labor, they didn't even release all the drugs recommended by the Advisory Council, which the coalition government has. And I know we're running out of time, but can I just mention on a health issue, today is World TB Day, and I congratulate Julie Bishop for an announcement of $7 million for research into mosquito-borne diseases, which are a massive issue in our part of the world.
Okay, just quickly, Emma, Jane throwing the responsibility there back to the states.
Well, we have a Liberal government here in New South Wales. Jane, so what say you there? We have not seen any uplift in the funding for Nepean Hospital structurally or from an infrastructure perspective. In fact, my helipad is closed at my hospital because they couldn't be bothered to upgrade it in the last 6 years of this government. So, she wants to play tit for tat, that's fine, but I'm saying $65 billion in a corporate tax handout as opposed to investing in hospitals and schools. You have choices and you choose to go down that path.
All right, Emma Hassard, Jane Prentice, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.